we are headed to Rome. And first thing I wanted to show you, I'm going to show you the steps that I want you to visualize today. So the idea is urban sketching. We are in Rome. It's a beautiful sunny day. I'm going to say it's about mid-afternoon, just past noon. And we are sitting right in front of the Colosseum. So I'm about to start a quick sketch. Just put something down on paper. What would be the first step for me to visualize and make this, as I recommend, with steps in simplicity? Number one, I'm going to turn down the opacity and go to the absolute most basic shape. I want to visualize this. I'm not asking you to actually draw this. You could, depending on which level you feel you are at. You're going to try to sketch out the absolute biggest and simplest shape first. So what I see, it's kind of a squarish thing. Obviously, I know this is more of a cylinder or kind of a bowl shape, but from my perspective, first thing I see is kind of an envelope shape that encapsulates this entire structure. From there, I want to take one step further, and I'm going to go to what fits within that simplest shape. So in that square or rectangle that I just did, the next step would be to see some of the line angles. So you could see that these lines on the side here, they are not necessarily, let me just go here for a second. They're not vertical. Vertical would be right here. But because we're looking from way lower down here, we're down here. We're looking up at it. These lines go away in perspective. So these lines eventually, at some point way up there, they will meet. So we're going to look at verticality of the line, and notice how these have just a little bit of an angle going up to meet each other, and that will develop our perspective. And we can also begin to see the rounding of the form. So the development of that simplified second stage shape. Next, we're going to go to what begins, I call them major lines. So some of the major lines that you would actually see within the structure. Obviously, these layers, when we see these layers, we begin to see the roundness of them and how they repeat. Notice one big thing here. The further up my layer, notice the curvature of it as I go down one and another. Notice how it begins to flatten out until it's going opposite. And I'm actually exaggerating here, but there's a moment when we are eye level where no matter how curved the line, it's going to be flat. And that's going to be called our horizon. So noticing how the curvature of the line, if we were to keep going up, that's going to get even more curved. So that is key. And finally, we are going to see all the other elements. So big thing here to notice is, notice how it's all divided into these nice, neat rows of columns. And obviously the one that's right in front of us, we are sitting right here. So this is us right here. Notice that this is the widest one. As the structure moves away from us, they become thinner and thinner and thinner until they actually look like they're meeting each other, like laying right on top of each other. So that distance is going to be key to give us that illusion of perspective. So those are going to be our steps. And from there, we're going to try to develop all of the other detail, which is just the final stages. But once you have these major things, I promise you, and one big one is going to be this structural detail here, this angle, diagonal, that is going to give us that thickness of the wall before we begin to work with lighting. So there we are. Next thing, first thing I want you to do is maybe grab a pencil and paper, and we're going to do some quick sketches, sort of thumbnails, to get a sense of, and I'm going to try to switch over to this one here. So here I am with a pencil, and this is just sketch paper right here. What I want to do is I'm going to try and do that study. There we are. Of the image. Let me put this a little further this way. And the first thing I mentioned was this. So we have that envelope square with the lines kind of leaning towards the center. Visualize there. And this bottom one here. So that's going to set me up for, the size. I could have made this a lot bigger, but it's just a quick thumbnail sketch to kind of help me visualize and understand where I am going from here. Next, we talked about making sure these lines are not vertical, giving us that sense of perspective going away from us. And the main thing is the rounding of our shape. So we're going to, obviously I started a little darker with darker lines. You want to make these a little lighter for your first structure lines. So I'm going to take a little bit of this. It's not too distracting. Pretending I did those a little bit lighter. So I have that going on. And I'm going to look at the bottom and make it round on the opposite direction. Not too much, but it's not flat. It's just a couple degrees of rounding also coming towards us. From there, the next step is going to be a little simpler. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4 rows, and I'm going to know that the bottom one is going to be a little bit flatter, but not as flat, and it kind of follows. And this is the trick here. It follows as it goes up and away. It gets narrower at the edges, and it gets a little thicker in the middle. The second row, putting it up a little, almost halfway in my structure, rounds just a little bit more. And here's a trick. Every time you draw volumes, when you draw cylinders or spheres, the closer you get to the edge, the sharper the angle becomes. So even though we have this very light curve going through the front here, as we reach the edges, remember this wraps around. So the degree of curvature in this part of the line becomes really way sharper to give us that illusion. And I'm going to go ahead and draw the third one, which would be even more curved than the previous. And that, remember, curving it way more towards the ends. And you can actually feel as if you were drawing a line right around the cylinder. Feel how it goes back and away and wraps around the edge of it. The next thing, and again, you can, depending on how precise you want it to be, I did count them. So on the outer wall, we're going to count this one here. And I'm just going to draw those lines straight down, pretty much, in this case, vertical. And I'm going to give it about this thickness, which will be the front of those arches that I'm going to see here at the bottom and through the middle here. And I'm not going to do that yet. I'm just giving you a little visualization. And remember, as we move towards the edges, they're going to get smaller or just a little bit thinner. One tiny step at a time. And as we get closer and closer to the edge, they become way thinner. Same on the opposite direction. So the second one, if we were thinking about numbers, let's think about this one as number 10. This is a number 9. So this one's about 8 in terms of thickness. And it goes to 7, 6. Think about millimeters maybe until it becomes 0. So this is a quick, really great way to gesture and do a thumbnail, which you could just play around with. And notice that we have not done any type of detailed drawing at all at any of this stage here. We want to begin to find these as our major structures. And from here, I could begin to learn to see how I see things, because the way I see this structure, this Colosseum, it's not the same way you might see it. Something might be more just catches your eye in a different way. And it could be more geometric, it could be more symbolic, it could be more descriptive, it could be more realistic, you name it. All the different ways in which our personalities are different, our psychology is different, the way we see and draw is completely different. So for me, thinking about like an engineer or an architect mind, it would absolutely see this completely different than we do. And what I want to do is make measurements. So I see one little thing here that takes me right across, right through the middle of this arch, and right towards the edge of the first, let's call that first layer, first story here, as it curves back in and it goes arched again just towards the edge of the second into the third. And then from there, it misses one column again halfway, and it goes up into the fourth row. And I'm talking about row 1, 2, 3, 4. And then finally, just a little touch and right at the edge there. So I'm beginning to darken these lines so you could see a little bit better with what simplicity you can actually put together something just as a quick sketch. And I'm going to call this a 5-minute. Let me just grab my eraser very quickly. And I'm going to just take some of this out of here. There we are. Now, what I want you to notice is how quickly we got here and how easy you can make this process to get to here. Once we get here, you really let your artistic license, your creativity take over. So that's what we're going to look at next. Now, for that, I want to show you a couple of samples. Let's just set this aside a little. And some of these samples, I'm going to actually show you very, very close. I'm trying to get good close-ups of this. This is done with ink, and it is using a technique it's called Scumbling, and I'm going to go over this. But all of this is just scribbly lines. So that's what I want you to see. Now notice that there's a little more space between some of the lines, and there's a little more saturation and density between the lines. There's a couple of lines that become longer and give a little bit of that reading of texture, and there's some that become a little bit shorter, almost like dots. And the patterns, how you arrange these lines, are the way we create the illusion of, in this case, a little forest, bunch of trees right at the end of spring, beginning of summer. So there you have it. And it is very powerful technique. So we're going to look at that. I want to show you one more sample. So this is another sample. This is, if you can recognize it, the Eiffel Tower. And it is done the way we are going to do our drawing today. So get you really close. Notice the quality of the line. Some of them, because it's a structure like the Colosseum, we can use straighter lines. But notice that in some areas, we leave empty space. So I did a little bit of a very light, soft pencil sketch, just like we did with our thumbnail. And then I went over with the ink pens to give it a little more emphasis in the structural lines, and little by little build up the detail with, as you can see, squiggly lines, some that are a little straighter. But how we put them together is going to be the key. What we're going to try to do is something like this, but of course with the Colosseum. And the technique that I was talking about is this one here. So this is Scumbling. When you look at Scumbling, I'm going to put this a little closer so you can see it better. You notice that the line is almost like script. It's like scribbling as you develop the light and shadow. So we're going to look at that as well. And also when they're more cross-hatching. And we did look at this one last time for some of you that were here with the bird. How easily you can put this and create the sense of volume, roundness, which we're going to do today with our colloseum. So this would be a good just visualize in terms of line how we're going to begin to develop those with the ink. And we go to our paper and we're going to start drawing. So for the first image that I had here, I just want to give you a refresher. We're going to look for, not that one. This, that gets us somewhere about here. And then we're just going to decide how to put those columns before we begin to put it down our detail. So as you have your paper, and I have this nice ink paper. There's different kinds of paper. So if you're going to work with ink, there are some shinier papers that have a type of coating that respond better to ink. This is one of those. And when that happens, I'm going to have to use a mechanical pencil for lighter lines. So you may not be able to see some of these as well as I want you to in order to keep them light. So I'm going to do them as dark as I can. I'm going to work landscape format. And I'm going to go ahead and pretty much get that size. The size of my colloseum, where the bottom, I want to make sure this line is not extremely leaning over. I want to get a better sense, but just enough that it gives me a realistic feel away from vertical. Now remember, this should be very loose. Right now you are very focused on the biggest, simplest shape with a nice, loose, sketchy hand. Now, your expectations of how you want this to look could be the one thing that actually, it's a different thing having a strategy than having just simple expectations and wanting to have this extremely realistic. The more realistic you want this to look, and by realistic I mean in terms of likeness, you want it to look you're going to have different strategies. So different types of measurement. So don't let that hurt the way you actually just see it and sketch it. Let me just take a measurement here. Allowing you to remain more in a free sketch mode. So some of these lines I am going to make lighter so I don't have to erase later. And there it is. I see my shape, cylinder shape, with that nice round top that obviously it's going to end somewhere about here. But I just want to visualize it all the way to see if it's matching with this side. I want to see and take a measurement, if you have to, of what I mentioned before, which does this line go right in the middle. And once I have that, I actually have a sense that it's just a little bit above middle. And just enough of the curvature. Remember, most of it happens just at the edges where we actually wrap around and back. But in the middle, it becomes flatter. So what I'm doing here is getting the first, to me, most important line, which would be what divides the bottom half and the top half. And I did make it maybe just a little too high, but I'll know better once I do what I feel is just right down the middle. So at this stage, I could also be just doing simplified lines. I don't even have to add too much of the curvature or the exact feel of the curvature. I could be doing just straight lines, getting myself a little bit better prepared into that structure that we talked about earlier. So I have a good sense, and this already to me looks good. Like I could build on this. I could make adjustments to it. Once I have enough information to get me to the stage 2 or stage 3, I could rearrange, erase, or replace with the ink a little bit better. So I'm going to start right here in the middle. And I'm going to push it not just from the middle, because I see what I'm calling that middle arch. And I'm talking about the one that where you can see the sky right through it on the second floor or the second layer. That one to me is not exactly in the middle. It's a little bit to the, just a touch to the right. So I'm going to make that adjustment, and I'm going to put the first column right here. And it goes straight down. And I'm going to make a measurement on how thick that first one is in relationship to what I lay down on the paper. And I'm going to say it's just about right here. And it goes right into the second layer as well. So these lines are just going to help me create that grid. Noticing that this one also goes to the second. And there's a little bit of a difference between the front outer perimeter of the wall, and we're looking at the second inner wall, and then all of this is the third section of the inner wall. So they all actually get smaller as they go in and away from us. So having that in mind, I'm going to actually, if I want to, go ahead and count how many arches are this direction from the middle, and counting this one, I count 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, barely 12. The 12 really just disappears. And to this side, I counting this one, including it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, going this direction. So from 10, and we said 12, did I say? So because they're smaller, there's going to be 1 or 2 more fitting on this side. So I want to keep that in mind, and I'm going to go ahead and kind of keep that in measurement, knowing that this is a little bit thinner. That's 2. And very intuitively, I'm just making educated guesses here for my third. And they're so subtle as they go away, 4, that we don't have to exaggerate yet, because they're very close. You can barely tell the difference between one and the next. It's more when you count between 2 and 3, how you see that they are getting away from us, meaning they're getting narrower and smaller. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. Yep, that should do it. And as they get a little bit closer to the edges, I'm going to make it just that much narrower. And at this point, I'm trying to match the edge of the line, meaning this one. So the direction of these are, as well, is going with the angle of that perimeter line. And 11. So these lines just kind of overlap each other. And I'm going to have to make an adjustment right here at the edge, knowing that this line just overlaps the other. Now I'm going to go this direction, and I'm going to make it, again, educated guess, looking at the thickness of it, and they look so similar. And I'm going to actually take these all the way up. Well, actually, no. 1, 2, 3. After the third one, which should be right here, I'm going to try to keep that line. And now I'm going to take this one to the third right there. From the fourth one, as they get narrower, I'm going to take that all the way to the top. And then the fifth. And the key here is getting just that sense of how much narrower and consistently. So notice that this is way wider than this one. And there's a subtle degree of thinning of the rows as I go in this direction. There we are. And I can count them like I said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I said 7. 8. And the last two are just literally overlapping. You barely see the shade or the shadow inside of that. So there we go. I got myself to that place where I can make some, just a quick, so I don't have to erase later when there's ink. And I might make a little mess. I'm going to get rid of some of these lines that helped me get here, but now could be distracting. I could, at this point, begin to look at what is horizon line and just kind of sketch it in very loosely, very quickly. I could see just what might be a little bit of trees back here, almost up to the second layer, really. And just sketch those in very loosely. You don't even see them. And now we're going to go to those major structural lines. So one tip that I always give is squinting at your image. So when you're looking at your subject, a great way to see what is important is when you squint really, really hard right through your eyelashes, and you begin to notice, ooh, okay, that line that comes down right here, and obviously what we kind of have, some of those lines that we already have in there. And then I begin to see all these little light and dark, the dark little kind of, the darkness of the arches that become kind of caves. I absolutely see that completely. So interpreting what you see as you squint through your eyelashes, or closing one eye. So closing one eye and kind of squinting at it, you begin to perceive sort of in a blur what actually is or can be some of the more important elements that will actually help you in your drawing. So I'm going to just do a few of those as I see here, knowing that this, maybe I should start here like I did previously, that these lines, I want to get a sense of how it goes up into the second level and a little bit of that angle. So I'm going to make these just a touch darker. How they have a little bit of thickness between the layers and how it goes pretty much to the end of that second arch. And again, I'm squinting here and I'm making educated guesses, interpreting what I see in terms of angle and in terms of relationships, how this connects to the top of the arch. And then from here, it keeps going up and then matches the upper part of that second tier. As it wraps around, then it goes in further. And I think as I would put this arch here, I actually see this coming straight up, looking for that angle. Once again, I'm looking to see how it relates to the top and then connect that all the way to the last one. So I could be pretty sure that if you were to show this to 10 people, 8 out of 10 would say, oh, that's the Colosseum already. Pretty sure. Even those that are not familiar with it would see what the structure already is telling you. And notice how much detail you put into this. It's actually making sure you get those lines that are important, essential is the word, in the right place. So I do see, as I squint, I want to make sure my edges, before I start adding detail, which is the last thing I want to do, especially now that I'm just giving myself kind of the guide, pencil line guides. I don't want to do double the work. So curving, making sure I see how these edges Because once I bring my ink pens out and I put that line down, that's it. It's there pretty much to stay. There's no way of lifting it. And that's the beauty of ink drawing. So I want to show you one more thing very quickly. And I might just make this a little bit bigger for a second. So we're looking at this image here. And I want to show you this. So this is called a notan. It's a Japanese word. And what it does is it shows you light and shadow. That's basically it. So because we're working with ink, if you were to do all the dark areas as you see them here, you would have success. This would be an absolute success if we were to just fill in the black with our ink, because it shows you the relationship between light and dark. So let me go ahead and just click this. Ooh, what happened? Keep your eyes on the image. So how do we train ourselves to see this when we're looking at this, which is how we see everything? So when we're looking at this, what I want you to see is this. That's simplifying light. When you begin to simplify light, you begin to see that just a couple of dots here and there do the trick for light and dark. And areas where actually you need to fill it up and darken it become pretty obvious. That also happens through squinting. So you should be able, when squinting at this image, be able to see what the darkest areas are and what the lightest areas are. And that's a very useful technique. So let's go back to what would be the next step. Well, now I want to begin to see if I can add. I see a little bit of thickness from the wall here. I see a row of little elements. So I'm just going to give myself a little guideline. And what I don't want is to make this confusing. But I do see a thickness between these layers with decorative elements right before my arches begin. And the next thing that I see, I want to see the thickness of these columns of the walls as I develop the next element. So here, I'm going to get a sense of my first arch and how thick and away from this line that I put here is going to be in relationship to the next one. So I want that thickness of this wall to show. And I pretty much have a consistent, once I have this, I want to make sure I have a consistent top for those arches. As they turn away, they're going to get thinner. They don't actually get thinner. It's just our perspective, as you know. And I just saw another line that comes right there. So there you go. The details in observation as we look closer. Something very important that popped up right here, which is these lines that separate the outer wall from the second wall, and then this becomes the third wall here. And the arches might get just a little bit that much smaller. So all I'm doing here is creating that thickness of the column and just giving myself a quick guide for arches. Now, all I'm doing is rounding the top. I can leave those lines so I don't have to do double the work when I come back with ink. And if you feel confident that you could see this and begin to develop it in ink, you should do that. But it's amazing. You'll see how quick, once you have all of these elements lined up, you bring in your ink work, and with just a little bit of patience and focus on light, dark, you can render this in no time. And that's it. As they get further out, the amount of detail that I have to put in there, it's so minimal. I'm going to just pretty much leave it alone. Now this one seems to be very important. So I'm going to go ahead and sketch it in. And you're going to notice something else. When I do an arch like this, I'm also going to see the thickness of the wall inside of it. So knowing a little bit of perspective, I'm going to see how thick it is, and I'm just going to follow it and round it out just like this. There's a little element that gives you kind of the top of it, as you can see it here, and that's going to be very helpful. So notice that in some of these you begin to see that, but I'm going to do all of that work when I come back with ink, because you, like I said, you don't want to do, I mean, you might, if you want to be that precise, give yourself a very nice, precise pencil sketch that gets you there. But for me, these type of guidelines are just to see it a little bit better, a little bit easier. And notice how this wall, it doesn't really get thicker. It's just we see more of it as if we were looking at it from the front because it's turning away. So we see a lot more thickness of wall here in the second one. And then by the third one, I can't even tell. It's totally pretty much black. There's no seeing through this one. The angle just covers it completely. Then we go to the fourth or fifth in this case. And as I begin to reach these outer edges, you in so many ways have to be more precise, but the truth is the detail is it's minimized. So there's no need to add it with pencil lines. I'm adding some of these features here that divide the top of these arches from the middle feature of layer 1, layer 2, and then the thickness, a little bit of a floor between that division of layer 1, layer 2, and the bottom of the arches, if you could see that. So there's like 3 elements here. The top of the arches, the middle of layer 1, layer 2, and then a little bit of a curving line for the base of the arches. And that's going to happen again at the top of the arches here. So I'm going to give myself a little line just like that. And it happens again, but a little less at the top. Because remember, we're seeing it from the bottom. So we don't see as much of it. And then we have the same thing happening right here at the top. And at this point, I think we are ready to bring out our ink pens. I'm just going to add one more, this one here, which is this major arch here. This one should be nice and neat. It is important. It is kind of a central. And notice that this one, because we're looking from below, we don't see sidewall as much. We see a little bit, but we see tons of top. So we see the ceiling of this arch as if we were underneath, inside of it. And that's what I see there. So that's going to become really dark. It's going to be a really cool element. And here, notice that I want to make the third ring of the wall, the third wall, inner wall, and give myself just enough of that curved line to kind of render some of these arches very quickly. And look, I just really just quickly sketching with no detail, which all of it could be done with ink pen. So there we are. It's time to bring out the ink pens. So I had these and I recommended this set as a starter kit. They're really good. It has a good range of sizes. The smallest is a 0.05, which is really, really pretty much all you need. But a good 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 gives you enough variety. I'm going to want to start with a 0.5 in this case, which would be the thickest. And just to be sure, you want to test it maybe on a separate sheet of paper like this and get a sense of, is that too thick? And I feel it's pretty close to what I want. And as I said, once you get to this point, you are roaming free. You are pretty much creatively beginning to actually draw. Before we kind of engineered and technically put together a structure, now is where you make decisions on, okay, how do I develop these lines? And what technique do I use? So if you could see where I am, I'm at the top and I'm up here. So outlining is generally the way we all do this. Now, what I want to do is I want to have a little bit of a jittery. Because it's stone, I want you to notice that my line is kind of broken. It follows some of the pencil marks that I had on it already. And I could literally just dash and dot my way. I could parallel hatch, creating a little bit of the shadows that I begin to see here. Some of those elements that do not need to be completely detailed. I hope you could see that. And I hope you could see how I got there. Let me show you from this perspective. That's pretty much all you need. And if you noticed, all I did was look at my subject, very important, squint, see some of the contrast, and break the line or make it darker according to what I see there. When I see little elements of decoration, notice that all I'm looking at is whether they are light, dark, and wherever there's shadow, I could simplify the illusion of it with just a few, literally, ink marks, dots, dashes. There's not much texture that I need to put up here unless I get a little bit finer lines. So I'm going to save that for the smaller pens. But the one thing you do not want to do, and again, I don't say don't do it. There are no rules. And you get to actually discover what works best for you. But what I don't recommend is just doing all the outline all the way through and then trying to fill in like if it was a coloring book. That actually, it's a great technique, but you need to be thinking about strategy. What is my strategy as I work along? Does it make sense to have to outline all of this all the way? I would do it section by section. Notice here, I'm parallel hatching. I'm not scumbling yet. And if I do see myself scumbling, I'm going to see in areas where I need lots of dark. For example, right here, I'm going to do just a little bit of it. But for the most part, because we're working with stone and architectural features, I'm going to be using broken line, parallel hatch, and maybe some cross hatching. Very minimal. But notice that I'm using just kind of like Morse code type dotting. Some lines become a little bit straighter and more complete. But it's all because of, as I squint, I see light, dark, and placement. And by placement, I see where that little shape of light or dark actually belongs. So some of these features, when we see them as and recognize them, we're going to want to actually put all of the detail in there. Try to avoid that. Simplify as much as you can, just focusing on light, shadow, the degree of light and shadow that you see. For example, here, notice that I have no pencil line, but I'm actually looking through this at that arch. And what I see in the sort of a straight line is mostly this shape right there, which I can then hatch. And it automatically gives me that illusion. Let me switch over so you can see how it's looking from this angle. So the arch, what is important is making sure you follow the direction of it, adding the elements in between, light and shadow. Another arch. And remember, we are urban sketching, so we're not taking a picture. We're getting a quick gesture of how we perceive this big, amazing structure as if we were just sitting right there, taking away what catches your attention. And as you begin to formulate and see the importance of really what are those, that word is so important, essential elements, essential lines, and essential light and shadow. As it moves away, it gets a little darker, but again, squinting at this point becomes your best friend. And trying to just copy what you see while you squint, it's literally minimized lines. You could see that it's just a couple of dashes and dots here and there, knowing that you could easily overdo it. So I use that metaphor of cooking, which is we don't want to overcook it. Stay on the side of you can always add more later. If you add too much at one point, it will be too much. And there's no coming back from that. So I'm going to begin moving my way down to the second layer through this side, seeing a little bit of that, again, squinting, little darkness, thickness of the wall, what seems to be like broken rock and brick. And just to the outer edge here. And you're going to see me begin to work a little bit faster, but you want to maintain your pace. That's also another very, very important part of this. You do not want to rush, and you also don't want to go too slow. You want to find that right, precise, comfortable pace. That makes this fun and in many ways meditative. That allows you to really enjoy and help you understand how you see and how you can transfer what you see onto paper. So this one here is fun because it seems very dark, but the truth is, here's where you use some of that cross-hatching. And very carefully, notice that there's a little bit of light inside of this dark area. So I could play with it. I could use layers of it. I want to make sure I'm getting a sense of direction. So it's not just a black hole. There's a little bit of volume and a little bit of light play inside of this space. So I want to get a sense of that. And by leaving some little spots in my crosshatch, we achieve that. We begin to get that sensation of space within that dark area. This, which I probably made a little too big, I'm actually going to shorten. So that's the great thing about pencil lines. See how I just adjusted here as I had my pencil mark way above it. Let me see if I can show you closer. Very important to see here. So I had a pencil mark for the early, and it was, as I drew this one here, and as I see it better, I noticed that it would have been too big. So I just readjusted. And now I could actually see much easier, much better how this aligns with the new shape and how I can develop it And for this one, I'm actually going to just do parallel hatch all the way through with less space between the lines. As I go all the way up, it gets darker. So I might cross hatch. And notice that I'm using directional lines to kind of give me a sense of which way the wall is going towards. There it is. There's a little structure right here. And so far, I've been working with one pen this entire time. So feel free to, as you see fit, shift to a thinner, thicker pen when you see fit. Different elements become a little more patient. You have to apply a different type of stroke, and you want to have the smaller the pen, the better you can add the line, but the longer it will take. So you want to have a good sense of patience, but also efficiency. Which is the best pen for this stage that I'm trying to work through here? I'm beginning to break the line. Move back over here. Getting a little sense of this, which is happening up here. As I go all the way through, and again, I want to make sure I pay attention to my reference photo. I don't want to make up too much information. So I want to make sure that, are there any breaks in the line over here? Is it just a straight line? Can I just break it a little bit, give it a little character, give it a little bit of rock feel? I'm going to leave this area here for later because I see that those decorative elements that kind of wrap out and around. And I guess I could do it now. There we go. I want to make sure they have a nice feel for that illusion of cylinder. And this comes up. A little more shadow underneath some of these elements. I should looking at that a little bit slower. Working my way down. So in a way, I'm doing what I said earlier, just trying to achieve kind of that perimeter and breaking the line just to give me a sense of finishing all the way through that outer wall. That second inner wall, and then this third wall there. So notice how very quickly from that early easy pencil sketch we can achieve, at this point I would say 9 out of 10 people. If you were to show this to 9 out of 10 people would agree, would actually recognize this immediately. If not, if they wouldn't know it as the Colosseum, they would say, well, it's a building that looks kind of like a cylinder and has these type of features. So notice that to me is the key. How much detail we feel we have to add to give that sense of likeness is usually what tends to hurt us. So knowing that you can develop stage by stage with little patience, focusing on what's essential. I might come back over here because there's a feel of light within this this arch here that might be a thinner line, maybe a parallel hatch, that's going to give me a feel of kind of being inside that wall. And literally up here, some of these like brick break lines as well. You're going to hold off that type of detail all the way through the end. Right now we're still at squinting and seeing the absolute basic essential features. And then you realize, okay, how good can I get at doing arches in perspective? So don't think of it as arch, just think of it as shapes. So there's a little curve, and then I want to identify if I could see light shadow shapes. And I definitely see some that are darker, they're thinner, and as they move away, they become darker and darker. So I'm not even looking at what's inside or behind some of these lines. I'm just looking at just the outer line of that, and maybe just the top or the wall of the inner wall of that arch. The space between them. And once again, just going over my pencil lines and identifying that shadow shape. Now for these shadows, that's where you're applying your technique. A lot of the lines should be parallel hatch, could have a little bit of that directional feel to them. So you have a sense of how the rock or brick is laid down in this area. And so you could make an easy recognition difference between one and the other. I'm going to come back with a smaller pen. But if you're really staying true to the absolute essential, you immediately begin to see how easy it comes together. And notice that here, it's just capturing that top little shadow of the roundness. You don't even have to finish the lines at the bottom. They could become so light, they could be pretty much just insinuated, and it will resolve it. The more you try to add, the easier you can overcook it. So I'm going to get a little more specific, looking for kind of that second level of light and dark. Trying really hard not to make up information that's not there. And really beginning to get a little more artistic. Maybe even a little more creative. Give the Colosseum a makeover. Trying to identify where I see a little window right here, round sort of shape with a little bit of sky in the background. So I'm going to want to do that. And then there's a structure up here with two little windows. So just spotting. And as I see the line, I could also see if there's a little dark, thicker element to it. And they repeat. But it's not even a sort of a pattern. I know I can imagine it's every other. It looks like every other column. But I'm spotting it and just notice dotting, adding it as very, very simple lines. I added this row and I'm going to want to kind of think it through. Should I continue with cross hatching? Can I add a different type of line to describe these elements? And I think I'm going to save some of these for the smaller pen. Doing lots and lots of squinting. Doing a lot of parallel hatching to the side. And one of the things I do, just be careful of becoming not automatic, but monotonous with the line. where you're not really thinking it through and not giving it a lot of variation, so it becomes a little repetitive. It's not that you cannot do the same line over and over, it's how you think it through, how you're going from one element to the other and giving it just that little extra bit of character. So these walls are really, really interesting. We see more detail inside of them. I'm going to keep it a little cleaner with more light coming through and a little more variety of line, just like that. And this is an impressive structure that you could really get carried away with. Now this one, we see the light on the outer wall, but it kind of gets darker inside. So that's a nice little switch up. I also see a little bit of shadow underneath some of these elements between the columns. And for some reason, this is the side where I was savoring kind of it, where I could see a little more clearer elements of light and shadow with volume. As you can see here, a little more perspective, less line, and more descriptive with just a few strokes. Notice that here at the end, you don't even see the inner wall. You just see a little bit of rounding at the top. And that's it. Beginning to understand how light affects the structures, the subjects that you're looking at is absolutely key. It's one of the last and most important things that we really learn to see, how light behaves, affects everything we see, and trying to capture that. It takes a lot of educating the eye. We're doing the squinting, hopefully, where we could kind of begin to see it. And the more you stick with it, the more you see the simplicity of it. What is shadow? What's a cast shadow? What's a core shadow? And all these things takes a little bit of getting familiar with them. But everything we see is because there's either light or shadow on it. And the quality of your lines should reflect that you actually are seeing it. And with a very simple read of, should it be this light or this dark? With just a quick squint, you will be able to see it. Some of my lines become a little longer. My cross hatching gets a little more simplified, more broken. And that's really all you need. A couple of long lines, a couple of gestures. As this gets further and further away, notice that the detail gets less and less, so your lines should be minimized just as well. And the elements that you want to describe could be done with just one quick broken line. And learning to do that gets you really, really far, really, really fast. So I just feel like I cheated my way through there, just dashing a couple of lines on there. And my opportunity to scumble comes here. So I'm going to place my pen down, and I'm looking at that treetop. And notice that I'm going to switch over here so you can see it a little bit better. There it is. So it's almost like if I was writing some kind of tree language, really. All I'm doing is looking at the contour, and I'm pretty much kind of making this information. So I'm doing just the outer edge of the tree, but notice that the scumbling is really just mark making, getting a little bit loose, grabbing the pen a little bit longer maybe, and just going in every direction, knowing how much you should be leaving in terms of space between the line or saturating. That is done by looking at what you are trying to represent. Squinting, and obviously as it gets near this edge here, it gets a lot darker, more saturated, and much finer. So the lines get more and more saturated and at the same time more blurred and finer. So it could be a good idea to stop and switch to another thinner pen for some of that. And I'll do that. And I could take that to the other side. And notice how quickly that comes together. And I was just really just scumbling, squiggling. And it's only done by really looking at what is on, in this case, I'm looking at the screen, but trying to really trace the nice little shapes almost carefree. I'm doing this really just carefree, and I'm seeing, believe it or not, you could see, and you have to train yourself to see the differences. And it's all green. Well, actually, there's a lot of lights and darks, lots of shift of light and shadows, lots of variation of line. And this one here to the front really gets very saturated. So scumbling is a great technique. Cross-hatching, as we can apply it, as you saw today, tons and tons of variations to give you the result in the detail that you're trying to achieve. Also using the right pen for those techniques. Very helpful. But notice here, I'm just really filling up the white of the paper and overlapping, oversaturating what I see as all these little leaves or pine tree. It looks like that beautiful Roman pine tree. I could use this as well to take it right into other subjects that I see there, and different types of lines, which this is a continuous line, just trying to capture that shadow shape, but not filling it in completely. I'm just going over, back and forth, wavy, giving me a sense of that shadow in between. I'm actually seeing a little bit of kind of a path and a road right here with grass. So the actual wanting to draw all of the grass that we see here, it's a whole different type of drawing. But I could see little horses and people, and I'm just scumbling my way through because there's no need for me to add detail to it. They're just going to be gestured in. And that's a crowd of people that I'm doing right here, as you can see. Just scumbled in as I never take my eyes off of my subject. Here I do, just to place the pen once again. And I just go the opposite way with, I don't even know what that is. I'm assuming it's a horse and carriage. But just the scumbling of color, difference in value, and shapes is what I'm trying to realize, put down. And then you come to realize, oh, it's just putting down lines, different types of lines, different values of lines. And learning how many lines do you have in you? How many different types of lines? And when you learn one and you see the variables, the possibilities of it, you realize, it's infinity. It literally is infinite possibilities. Doing a little more cross-hatching right into some of these areas. And at some point, I'm going to want to stop myself and call this, I don't want to say done, but that is the biggest part. Of coming to a drawing and saying, let it breathe. Let me step back. Look at it with fresh eyes. And maybe then give it a chance to, okay, yeah, it is done. Or come back in and add, I'm switching over to a 005 and just beginning to add some of those smaller lines that are not as saturated, thick, or dark, where I would see some of these finer breaks in the brick. And it's not even hatching or cross-hatching. This is just, well, somewhat parallel hatching. And I'll go to the other camera to show you what I mean. So in this area, for example, here, much finer lines. So I'm just doing kind of patterns of, I could even count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That kind of pattern. You could almost turn it into a scumbling. Continuous line. But there's just little breaks as you see patterns, little details, and interpret them with looseness, with broken lines. And the difference in quality of line from one pen to the other, it's beautiful. So the more you give yourself a chance to play within varieties of pen, you're multiplying infinity times infinity for the characteristics of your line. And notice that some of these things that I can do here absolutely just feel right. Let me go back here to show you, for example, this area that I mentioned. There's a lightness to it. It's not as light as these in the front, but it's not as dark as the hatching I was doing before. So I'm just creating a parallel hatch here and maybe a very tiny cross hatch right over it to create that sense of volume and space, whereas this would be actually sky. And now we can feel the difference. And all of these elements, as they go away, the line gets thinner and thinner. And done. So I know we're kind of under the clock. I'm trying to do as much as I can, as fast as I can. But this should be something that should take you at least a full hour, maybe an hour and a half, to just develop something as saturated as this. I would revisit this, or maybe a section of it, and play with it, with the different types and different quality of lines that you can think of. Focusing mostly on that parallel hatch, cross hatch, broken hatch, meaning line dot kind of squiggle-ish line. If you feel like maybe scumbling into it, absolutely you can do that. There's nothing that can stop you. And learning from it is going to be the key. What's working and what isn't working, so you can modify it. So there we have it, the Colosseum. I hope you had fun.